Thank you, guys. It's wonderful to be here. And so I've been going to the UN Climate Summit since 2009, and I've learned a lot from going there. In fact, when I was in college, I really didn't have much of an opinion on climate. But as I started going to these summits and I started interviewing, at this point I've interviewed hundreds of climate scientists, virtually all of them on the skeptical side. One of the interesting things is the alarmists don't really want to talk to me, which is interesting. I've reached out to the UN IPCC more times than I can count. I just did an article a couple of weeks ago about these major new studies in the peer-reviewed literature showing that almost all, in fact all or even more than all of the observed warming of the last few decades can be explained through the urban heat island effect and changes in total solar irradiance. I reached out to Gavin Schmidt. He didn't respond. I reached out to Michael Mann. They didn't respond. And I think that's interesting. If you're confident in what you have to say, if you truly believe what you're arguing, why would you not want to talk to somebody who maybe has a different opinion? So I've watched this evolution. When I was a kid, they were still promoting the global cooling thing. It slowly morphed into global warming, then climate change. And as I've been going to these climate conferences, I've noticed this increasing shrillness. It became the climate crisis, then it was the climate emergency. I was on the Sinai Peninsula last year for the latest UN Climate Summit, and it became, we're headed to climate hell, and I'll show you guys that. And so, I'm not here to necessarily talk about the science. I'm just going to share with you some of my observations, and I believe you can disprove the entire narrative without knowing anything about science. One of the things you do is you look at the predictions they've made. They've made 50 years now worth of predictions on the climate, and they could not be more wrong. Unless you think I'm cherry-picking, I challenge you to find some predictions that they've made that have actually come true. Look for falsifiable predictions where they said this will happen by this date, and what you'll find is in every case that I could find, they were absolutely wrong. Here's one interesting graph. I use this a lot. The red line right there is the average of the UN's climate models and their predictions for what would happen as CO2 concentrations increased in the atmosphere. What you see with the green and the blue lines is what actually happened as measured by the weather balloons and the satellite data. I tell people, and I'm only half joking, you could give dice to a monkey in a cage and have the monkey roll the dice, and the monkey would have a much better track record of predicting what would happen to the temperature based on this data. And the laws of probability would suggest that something very fishy is going on here. Every single one of their predictions massively overestimated what would happen to the temperature. Now you go back to the 1970s and even into the 80s, they were warning of the ice age that was coming. A University of California professor, Kenneth Watt, an ecology professor, warned that if present trends continue, the world will be 4 degrees colder by 1990, 11 degrees colder by 2000. That's twice what it would take to put us in an ice age. They predicted starvation and other horrors. In 1971, the next year, Stanford University professor Paul Ehrlich, author of the infamous population bomb, he's a neo-Malthusian who believes there are too many of us on this planet. You find this theme is very common among the climate alarmists. Back then he was warning about global cooling. But he said by the year 2000, the United Kingdom is going to be a small group of impoverished islands inhabited by some 70 million hungry people. If I were a gambler, he said, I would take even money that England would not even exist in the year 2000 and give 10-to-1 odds that the life of the average Briton would be of a distinctly lower quality than it is today. And of course, that all failed to materialize. 40 years later, he was warning that we were going to become cannibals because of global warming. And I suspect he's wrong about that as well. Now, in 1975, and don't think it was just Newsweek, all the big publications were harping on this global cooling. This was called The Cooling World. It was a major article in Newsweek. They said climatologists are pessimistic that political leaders will take any positive action to compensate for the climate change or even to allay its effects. Now, what's really interesting about this is that the solution to global cooling was exactly the same as the solution to global warming. Less energy, lower standard of living, more government control, more taxes, less fossil fuels, etc. And thankfully, nobody listened to these quacks back then. They actually reported in the article that some of the more spectacular solutions proposed by these man-made global cooling theorists included melting the Arctic ice cap by covering it with black soot. So again, thankfully, nobody listened back then. Now, in 1991, the Club of Rome got together. This is Al Gore and Mikhail Gorbachev and globalists and communists and very influential so-called environmentalists. The Cold War was winding down, and they knew they needed a new justification for this massive government and these huge taxes. And so they came out with a report. It was called the First Global Revolution. And they said, in searching for a common enemy against whom we can unite, we came up with the idea of global warming. This would fit the bill. They said this is caused by human intervention, and the real enemy then is humanity itself. Frankly, I don't think humanity is the enemy of the planet. That's my personal opinion. Another way you can show, without any science at all, that the people leading this bandwagon do not believe these things themselves is by looking at what happened in 2015. I was at the UN Climate Summit in Paris, and it was very bizarre. You had world leaders celebrating their accomplishment. And what they accomplished, you had Barack Obama and all the Western leaders said they were going to dramatically slash CO2 emissions from their populations within 5, 10, 15 years, depending on which country. Then the Communist Chinese said, well, we will continue increasing our CO2 emissions until about 2030. For perspective, Communist China already releases massively more CO2 than all of the Western world combined. Every unit of economic production in Communist China releases drastically more CO2 than that same unit of economic production would in the United States or Japan or Switzerland or Canada or Australia. The worst possible thing you could do if you believe CO2 is bad for the planet is shut down American industry, shut down American manufacturing, and ship all that to China. And yet that's exactly what they did, and they patted each other on the back and gave each other high fives. How could you do that if you really believe CO2 is bad for the planet? Here's some more data on Communist China's CO2 emissions versus American CO2 emissions. Very interesting. So what did they do? As their predictions all failed, well, they just increased the shrillness. One of the things that NOAA did, they actually changed their color scale. There's the 2008 color scale. It doesn't get dark red until 110 degrees. Starting in 2014, it gets dark red at 90 degrees. So you probably grew up and you saw bright red. You said, oh, no, that's terrible. It must be really warm outside. Well, in 2014, that all changed. Here you see the side-by-side comparison. Another thing that happened is the media doubled down on this. Over 500 leading so-called media outlets got together and they signed a statement promising to start referring to climate change as the climate emergency. And you would all recognize the names of these publications. They're very big and very well known. Another thing they decided to do is just silence people who point all of this out. Here's the UN communications czar, Melissa Flemings, talking to the World Economic Forum about their partnership with Google to suppress everything that we are putting out.
You know, we partnered with Google, for example. If you Google climate change, you will, at the top of your search, you will get all kinds of UN resources. We started this partnership when we were shocked to see that when we Googled climate change, we were getting incredibly distorted information right at the top. So we're becoming much more proactive. You know, we own the science, and we think that the world, you know, should know it, and the platforms themselves also do. But again, it's a huge challenge that I think all sectors of society need to be very active in.
Yeah, we own the science, she goes on to say. I can confirm that this is true. My article on UN Agenda 2030 that I wrote in 2015, right when it was adopted, was at the top of every Google search result for years. When you typed in Sustainable Development Goals, UN Agenda 2030, Agenda 2030, every single result brought back my article. Now you literally cannot find that article on Google, period. Even if you put in the exact headline with my name, you have difficulty finding it. It takes pages and pages. So they're doing this deliberately, they're doing it strategically, they know they're losing on the science, they know they're losing public opinion, so they're indoctrinating our children, and they are censoring people who point out the flaws in all of this. Now, you know, they tell you that all scientists agree. That's absolute baloney. Like I mentioned, I've interviewed hundreds of scientists over the years. I'll give you just a representative handful of examples. So at the latest climate conference, they came out with a document that said we needed to totally restructure the world's energy systems. They said literally trillions of dollars had to be invested in this. What are your thoughts on whether that's a good investment or not?
You know the answer to that, so why are you asking? I mean, it's a terrible investment, it's waste of money, and it's going to hurt billions of people. It's immoral.
Immoral. That's Richard Lindzen, meteorologist, emeritus at MIT. This is Dr. Nils Axel Morner. He passed away. This is me and him at the Baltic Sea, at the edge of the Baltic Sea in Sweden. He was a sea level reviewer for the UN IPCC. And he told them they could not publish this. This was fake. There was no global sea level rise. It was all a hoax. Well, they published it anyway, so he resigned. But this is what he had to say about sea level rise.
So tell us a little bit about this whole sea level issue. I just came from the COP24 in Poland,
And over and over again, we heard that our cities are going to be flooded. I'm from Miami. They say my city is going to be flooded. Are we all doomed from sea level change to start with?
Absolutely not. I mean, there is no big rapid sea level rise going on today, and there will not be. On the contrary, if anything happens, its sea will go down a little. But also, there is nothing which is called global sea level. It is different in different parts of the world.
It's a 30-minute interview. I encourage you to watch it. YouTube deleted it, of course, so we had to repost it on Rumble. They deleted it after it got 100,000 views because that's what they do. They don't want you to see the truth, right? He was the head of the geophysics department at Stockholm University, was widely known as the world's top sea level expert until he started exposing these lies. Here is our colleague here, spoke about him a moment ago, Dr. Will Haffer, Princeton physics professor emeritus, also Donald Trump's climate advisor more recently. Does the world need carbon taxes?
No, of course the world doesn't need a carbon tax. They're talking about a CO2 tax, and CO2 is actually good for the world, so people ought to be encouraged to make more of it.
So why do you think they're pushing this idea of a CO2 tax then, if CO2 is good for the world?
Well, it's a combination of people who've been misinformed badly, people who need to feel virtuous. They don't believe in anything anymore, so now they've got something to believe in to save the planet. And then it's the opportunists who are making a good living out of frightening everybody and sucking money out of the common man, you know, to push idiotic energy solutions on them that make everyone poorer and provide less reliable energy, less affordable energy. So there's nothing good about it. It's the same evil fanaticism that's plagued mankind since we began.
Yeah. Actually, I was at the UN Climate Conference in Paris, as I mentioned. I met Dr. Yves Marco. He was a professor at the Catholic University of Louvain in chemistry. He was also the head of the European Chemical Society. He's also passed away. But here's what he had to say.
Evidence, I repeat, not one single physical scientific evidence that shows that carbon dioxide emitted by human beings has any effect whatsoever on the temperature of our Earth.
God told us to be fruitful and multiply, yet they're teaching our children that having babies is bad for Mother Earth. And you can apply this to any issue. I do believe the reason they're working so hard on getting the children is because they realize they're not going to get the adults anymore. Obama famously called conservatives and Christians bitter clingers. They're clinging to their guns and their Bibles, their religion, and they're not willing to change. So I do believe that indoctrinating children in public schools is the primary mechanism that they are using to bring not just the United States, but the whole world on board with this. We see it with Greta Thunberg. Every Swedish child is getting an overdose of this kind of propaganda in school. It is happening everywhere. They're teaching them that the gas they exhale is a toxic pollution, but if they pay enough taxes to the UN and buy enough carbon credits, that somehow they're going to make the temperature of the Earth perfect. It's ludicrous, but a kindergarten child doesn't know that, right? They were told by their parents to listen to the teacher, and so we're in this situation now where we've got a whole generation of young people who've been totally indoctrinated with this, who've actually been conditioned to not think about it logically, not think about it reasonably, not examine the evidence, but just shut down mentally whenever they hear something that contradicts it. So I believe that's the biggest crisis we're facing when it comes to this issue, is the indoctrination of our children and everything that follows from that, right? It's bad enough that they believe absurdities, but when you take these absurdities that's now the core of their belief system and you extrapolate the implications of that, they're being told that having children is bad for the planet. How are they going to start families? They're being told that energy is bad. They're being told that agriculture is bad. John Kerry's now been running around the world saying that we have to shut down 1/3 of the farms. It's simply craziness, and it needs to be stopped.